Welcome to fifth installment of Tasting Together. My name is Pat Fahey. I'm Master Cicerone. I'm the content director for the Cicerone certification program. And today we're going to be talking about Kölsch. I am thrilled. So before we get started, just talk a little bit. Tasting Together, we've been doing this for a few weeks now, and the goal is to bring a bunch of people together, taste a beer, offer you guys kind of a lighthearted educational perspective on a given style or a given beer, but also just to kind of, get together and taste together while we're all stuck at home during this time. So if you've been with us in the past, thanks for coming back. I had an awesome time talking about and drinking Saison last week. If this is your first time, one of the things that I always like to say, be sure if you have any questions as we're going through, fire them off in the chat. I'm not going to be watching the chat too closely, but I have somebody watching it for me, and they'll feed questions to me. So if you have any questions at all as we're going, don't hesitate. I'll do my best to get to them before we're done. Another couple of notes. We've got 4 more weeks sort of planned out so far in case people want to buy beer sort of in a batch rather than having to go to the store every week. So just to let you guys know what's coming up. Next week, April 29th, we're going to be doing Goose, which should be a lot of fun. Following that, we'll have Irish Stout, Flanders Red Ale, and then Rauch beer on May 20th. And as of yet, we haven't yet made solid determinations on what styles we're going to be doing beyond those 4 weeks. This is going to be not scientific at all, and I make no promises, but if you want, like, just throw out a style that you'd be interested in us chatting about. Toss it out in the comments. We'll take a look and see what we can do about any of the ones that you guys throw out. There are a lot of different things that I'd be excited to talk about, but I definitely want to make sure that we're hitting on stuff that's interesting to you guys, the people out there. Last thing then too, if you haven't yet, hit the subscribe button, stay up to date on what we're putting out. For those of you that didn't see it, we had our first of a series of certified beer server prep talks that we're doing. Started yesterday, and it's going to run for 12 sessions on through the end of May. That's being done with Master Cicerone Neil Whitty. We're doing those every Tuesday and Thursday. They're at 1 p.m. Central Time. You can find them right here on our channel on YouTube. And just for anybody that's interested in checking it out tomorrow, I think the one that we're doing tomorrow is on how to build your sort of your personal descriptive flavor vocabulary, and then talking a little bit about malt and malt flavors. And so, if you're interested or you know anybody that you think would be interested, go for it. So we're talking about Kölsch, and I am drinking Gaffel Kölsch. It can be a little bit hard to find fresh versions of German Kölsch here in the US, and I saw some people commenting that they weren't able to find Kölsch at all. I was able to find this in pretty good shape. It's still not quite as fresh as I might have hoped, but pretty solid representation of the style. If you haven't already, throw it in the comments. Let us know what you're drinking. I saw at least one other person drinking Gaffel as well, but seen a bunch of people with some other German brands, some with American iterations of those brands. So lots of different stuff out there. Now, I have already seen in the comments like several people harping on my glassware, and I appreciate that very much. It's like the first thing I wanted to address. As you can see, I am drinking out of a tulip glass. I drink most things out of a tulip glass just due to our glassware selection here and because I love the glass shape. However, it's maybe particularly a sin with this style, given that Kolsch does have a very, very specific glass shape associated with its service. The glass, excuse my awful German pronunciation, but the glass is called a Stange. It's I'm gonna type it in the chat real quick, but it's basically like the word strange without an R in it. It's German for rod or pole, and what it's a reference to the fact that the glass is basically a very narrow cylinder, straight sided. Here's a picture of one. So it's a narrow, straight sided glass shaped like a rod or a pole, hence the name. Germans tend to be very like literal in their naming of things, which can be convenient. But the glass is not just I mean, it's associated with the style because the style is usually served in that glass, but the glass also ties to the specific way that Kolsch is generally served if you were to drink it anywhere in Cologne, the city that it's from. And it has such a like an exciting method of service that I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about the way that Kolsch is usually served. So for those of you who have never been to Cologne, or Köln as the name is in Germany, most bars there are going to feature beer from one specific brewery. And oftentimes they're only going to be serving one beer, and that beer is Kolsch. And so you have these little rod-shaped glasses. The glasses are not very big. They're like 200 milliliters is the standard size, which is a little bit less than 7 ounces. And so normally we see, you know, lower alcohol beer in larger glasses, higher alcohol beer served in smaller glasses. Doesn't make a lot of sense. This is a beer style that's like 4.5% alcohol. Why is it served in a 7-ounce glass? It all has to do with the way that it is served in Cologne. So you're at a bar, has one brewery, has one brand, and you have waiters just running around with trays full of Kolsch. So as you're drinking your small glass of Kolsch, like as soon as you finish the glass of Kolsch, another one magically appears in front of you. It is truly like it's adult Disneyland. It's amazing the way that the service works out. So the way that they track it is basically every time they drop off a new glass of Kolsch for you, they make a tick on your coaster. And once you are done, they just look at your coaster and you pay based on the number of ticks on your coaster. Now, as a pro tip for those of you out there, if you're ever in Cologne, if you want them to stop serving you Kolsch, you need to take your coaster and set it on top of your glass, and then they'll stop just bringing you glass after glass after glass. I was talking before this chat with my roommate, fellow Master Cicerone Avery Swanson, and she relayed to me an anecdote of being in Cologne, and she was not aware of what you needed to do to make them stop serving you Kolsch. And so they just like kept bringing Kolsch after Kolsch. And she's like, so now you know, if you want them to stop, which you won't for a while, but when you do want them to stop, take your coaster, you put it on top of the glass. And it's funny because like it's served in this really small portion, but it's such a crushable style of beer that it's easy to just like, if you're sitting down and chatting with friends, it's easy to just drain glass after glass of Kolsch, and before you know it, you're like, oh, I've got 10 ticks on my coaster. Like that's 2 liters of beer. Oh geez. So honestly, that's one of the reasons why I was so excited to talk about this style. As a lot of people who know me can attest, like my favorite styles of beer are beers that you can drink a few of, just like beers that are drinkable, or as I like to say, crushable. And Kolsch definitely fits the bill on that one. So awesome beer, really cool method of service. You really don't find that style of service anywhere else outside of Cologne. Maybe in Dusseldorf, which is also in the Rhine River Valley nearby. They have a similar method of service in there. In that city. They're serving alt beer rather than Kölsch. But like outside of those two cities, I haven't ever seen anything exactly like that, and it's really awesome. So I didn't say this at the outset. So cheers, guys. It's good to have all you here. So, talk a little bit about Kolsch history. Kolsch comes from Cologne in Germany. And when you look at like German beer styles on the whole, Germany as a country is best known for their lager styles and then their wheat ales, think like Hefeweizen type beers. But Kolsch belongs to this relatively small family of ales that we refer to as Rhine River Valley ales. The two styles that we consider to be part of that family are Kolsch from Cologne and alt beer from Dusseldorf, which is like a 30-minute train ride away from Cologne. It's just up the Rhine River. So most of those styles, those lager styles, and those like Hefeweizen style beers, come from Bavaria. The area in and around Munich. Cologne is very separate from that part of the country. Those cities are just on the western edge of Germany, so they're very close to the border with Belgium. It's about twice as far from Cologne to Munich as it is from Cologne to Brussels. So the influence of lager brewing is not quite as strong there. They have a pretty long history of brewing ale type beers in Cologne. So when you look at the history of this style, its creation dates back to like the late 1800s, following the development of Pilsner in the Czech Republic in the 1840s. That style and those kind of pale lager beers spread across continental Europe and were very much kind of like the most popular beer in a lot of different places. And you look at numerous pale beer styles from Europe, like there's almost always a footnote in their history that is like, to some extent, this style was developed to compete with the popularity of Pilsner. Kolsch is no different. The original formulations of this beer would have been to compete with the popularity of Pilsner as it moved from the Czech Republic to Eastern Germany to Western Germany. Now, it wasn't like, and I've read some accounts that it was like Kolsch brewers or ale brewers in Cologne were like, we're not going to brew lager beer here. We're going to stick with our traditional ale. That's not exactly how it went down. From what I've read, it seems that like in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was adoption of brewing lager styles. There were a lot of different styles of beer being brewed in the area. It wasn't really until after World War II, which really, World War II took a pretty big toll on a lot of parts of Germany, but I think I read Cologne went from pre-World War II, it was like a city of 750,000 people. Immediately post World War II, 40,000 people living in the city because it's just totally decimated. So in the rebuilding of that city, it seems the brewers kind of coalesced around this style. And in I think the year is 1986, we saw the brewers of Cologne come together to sign what was known as the Kölsch Convention or the Kölsch Pact, which basically established the style as a regional appellation that could only be used by brewers in Cologne. And it established that style of beer, Kölsch. The description, I just have it quoted. So it was a light-colored, highly fermented, strongly hopped, bright, top-fermented Voll beer. And really quick, Voll beer, what that means, that's one of the strength designations in Germany. For those of you that were here for the Doppelbock talk, A lot of German law and strength designations don't have to do with ABV; they have to do with original gravity. So one of the categories of German beer that a lot of beer falls into is fall beer, and that's which is like 1044 to 1048 ish original gravity if you're dealing in that system. So that's going to give you a beer that's maybe between 4.5, 5.5% alcohol. But yeah, so 1986, brewers of Cologne established this style and established this appellation. To this day, in Germany, you cannot name a beer a Kölsch unless it is being made by one of those breweries in Cologne. We see in the U.S. we'll call beer anything because those laws don't necessarily apply, but it is a respected and legally binding appellation in Germany. So, and I see here from Shayna, I'll just address this now. Ophelia had a question: do Americans have to say Kölsch style? No, they don't. It probably would be more proper to say that in sort of respect to the appellation. If you were in Germany, you could not even say that. You couldn't say you couldn't use the word Kölsch at all on a label if it wasn't coming from Cologne. Sometimes you will see people in the US call it Kölsch style, I believe for that reason, because it's not technically a true Kölsch unless it comes from Cologne. But no, there is no law that says that we can't call things a Kölsch in the US. So, talk a little bit about the production process for Kölsch. The recipe for Kölsch, as with a lot of German styles of beer, is pretty simple. There are slight variations, but a lot of times the malt bill for Kölsch is just going to be 100% Pilsner malts. The hops that are used for this style are going to be traditional German noble varieties, things like Hallertau, Spalt, Tettnang, Hersbrucker, maybe. And like with a German Pils, this beer, in addition to having usually like pronounced or at least like moderate, firm bitterness, also will usually have a little bit of hop flavor and aroma from those traditional noble hop varieties. So kind of like a floral, perfumey kind of hop aroma profile. The place where Kölsch is probably the most unique has to do with its fermentation and how the fermentation and post-fermentation is managed. So, like we said, Kölsch is an ale, it's unlike most beers in Germany, it's not going to be fermented with lager yeast. However, it's typically going to be fermented a little bit cooler than most ales are. Most ales are fermented around 68 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 20 degrees Celsius. Kölsch fermentation might be closer to like 59 or 60 degrees Fahrenheit or like 15 degrees Celsius. So it's not quite as cold as you'd expect out of a lager fermentation, which is going down maybe all the way to 50 degrees Fahrenheit or like 10 degrees Celsius. But it's kind of smack in the middle of the two. And the result of that is that you get less ester formation, less fermentation flavor than you would out of an ale yeast fermenting at a warmer temperature. Another thing about this beer is that while it is not made with lager yeast, it is typically lagered after fermentation is complete. Lagering refers to the process of near freezing temperature storage to allow kind of the yeast to slowly metabolize additional fermentation products, to allow the beer to clarify by having things settle out of the beer at those cold temperatures. So Kölsch is typically going to be lagered, even though it is an ale. And this actually leads to some amount of label confusion like if you're an American trying to interpret a German label of the beer, because they treat the terms ale and lager differently than we do. This is kind of like an interesting sidebar. in the US at least, the kind of school of division of whether or not a beer is an ale or a lager is whether or not the beer is made with ale yeast or lager yeast. In Germany, they call a beer a lager if it's been lagered, regardless of whether or not it was made with ale yeast or lager yeast. So the labeling on a Kölsch in Germany, I'm not even going to try to give it like the German the German words for it, but it translates to a top fermented lager beer. So it's a top fermented lager in Germany, whereas in the US we would say it's an ale because it's made with an ale yeast strain. Just kind of like a different manner of classifying things. So to talk a little bit about flavor profile of just Kölsch generally and also of the one I'm drinking. So from this one, I get kind of like a light, grainy, crackery malt note to it. Malt is maybe even a little bit secondary to sort of light, fruity ester character along the lines of like kind of like a Honeycrisp apple, maybe a little bit pear-like, maybe also like a touch of cherry blossom sort of note there. As I mentioned up front, this isn't like the freshest beer that there ever was. So I don't get a ton of hop character on this beer. I would imagine a little bit more floral hop aroma might be present if it was a touch fresher. And it also does have just like this one does have just like a little touch of T2N. Definitely not characteristic for the style. Just happens to be present in this one that I'm drinking right now. Outside of like specific aroma characteristics, one of the other things that's extremely characteristic of the Kölsch style generally is that it's typically very highly attenuated. Remember, attenuation is how much of the sugar yeast consumes during fermentation. So a very highly attenuated beer has like a lighter, thinner body and is typically very dry, has very little residual sugar present. As a result of that, even though these beers are usually only moderately bittered, we're looking at like, I think the BJCP spec is 18 to 30 IBUs, because there's so little residual sugar, they usually have a pretty pronounced level of bitterness given that level of IBUs. So firm bitterness in part as a result of the very high attenuation. Another thing that I want to point out too is that, like, at least in the US, the Kölsch drinking experience is very different. Trying to, drink a German brand of Kölsch versus having it in Cologne. That's true in a lot of cases. Having beer fresh and close to the source, if you're able to, if you kind of are lucky enough to be able to make it to those places, does give you some probably better insight into how the beer is meant to be enjoyed or how it tastes when it's really fresh. I would say with a style like Kölsch, though, that is especially true. It's lower alcohol. It's a rather delicate style. It's not one that holds up to time as well as we talked about Saison last week. Saison can stand up to time a little bit better than something like a Kölsch can. So, if possible, try to enjoy it really fresh. If you can find like a brewery wherever you happen to be that makes it, or if you ever have the chance and are in Germany or even in Belgium, make a trip to Cologne. It's absolutely worth it. The first time I ever went was like a 1-day train trip when I was in Belgium, and I was like, I haven't been before. It's a 2-hour train ride to get there. I have to go and see Cologne and drink Kölsch where it's from. So definitely worth it if you ever have the opportunity. Now, I haven't brought it up yet, but one other kind of lens that's useful to understand Kolsch through is through comparison to a very closely related style, and that's German Pils. A lot of people will talk about Kolsch as sort of the ale version of a German Pils, and the two do share a lot of similarities. If I had to peg differences between the two, and as I will sometimes throw out a nugget, like if you're trying to prep for a tasting exam for certified Cicerone or even advanced Cicerone, this is a style comparison tasting that comes up a lot, Kolsch versus German Pils. The biggest difference you'll find between the two is typically that presence of esters in the Kolsch that you won't find in the Pils. So a little bit of kind of fruity character, usually somewhere in that apple, pear, cherry, white wine grape kind of realm. Outside of that, there aren't a like in a lot of cases the other characteristics overlap so much that there aren't like super clear differences. You might expect a little bit more hop flavor and aroma from a German Pils, but Kolsch can feature some amount of that as well. So presence or absence of esters is big distinguishing point between those two styles, should you ever encounter them on an exam. And then last thing to touch on before I get to taking questions, as always, talk a little bit about pairing. Kolsch is a great pairing beer just because, in part because it is so quaffable, like it is so drinkable, it can work with a wide variety of things. It's a rather delicate beer, but it can serve as a refresher. So in some cases, this gets at kind of a more nuanced aspect of pairing, but like pairing doesn't always have to be an intricate dance between the beer and the food where, you're getting specific interactions happening, like you're having specific things happen to the beer and having specific things happen to the food. Sometimes like you can build a beautiful pairing where the beer is purely an accompaniment. It stays kind of out of the way, and it just acts as kind of like a lubricant for the meal and the conversation and what's going on. And I think Kolsch is a great example of that. In a lot of cases, like if you wanted to put together a pairing where the Kolsch is really getting to shine, you're going to have to stick to more delicate fare. But in Germany, a lot of their food is a bit heavier. You're looking at a lot of sausage, a lot of pork products. It's not going to necessarily do the Kolsch a lot of favors, but the Kolsch will play with that food just fine. Like it will work alongside it and will act as like a great companion to those dishes. And I think you can extrapolate that to like Kolsch is one of those beers that I love in like a backyard barbecue setting. Like it's kind of like it's almost like a refined Pilsner a little bit. Not that Pilsner's not refined. I love Pilsner. But you know, backyard barbecue setting, you got like hot dogs and burgers. This is going to be awesome refresher to taste alongside those things. If you wanted to put together a pairing that really did sort of play to the Kolsch a little bit more, especially like to think of like how you would use Kolsch differently than a German Pils. You're looking at kind of highlighting that ester character. So if we're in the cheese realm, something fresh and light, like I think like fresh chev or goat cheese, mozzarella, maybe even burrata or something along those lines. Um, Outside of cheese, Kolsch can work really nice with a lot of different salad courses just because you can, especially if you have fruit or citrus present in the salad, the fruit notes that are present in Kolsch can work really well with that. Another place that I think Kolsch is really nice is with seafood. A lot of different kinds of seafood can work nicely with Kolsch, and you could do things like oysters or mussels, but like it can also work with things that are a bit richer as long as the presentation is a little bit, it stays simple. Um, you know, you've got a fair amount of carbonation, you've got firm bitterness. So you could put Kolsch with something like fried clams, fried shrimp, pan-fried scallops, even like poached lobster in a butter sauce. And I think Kölsch would pair really nicely with those different dishes. So, so yeah, that's all of the stuff that I had prepared to say about Kölsch. Let's see what people wanted to know about. Let's see. Somebody asks, somebody asked early on when we were talking about portion size, isn't the portion size based on the ideal temperature for drinking the beer? This helps to ensure that people are sipping on it at the preferred temperature. You know, it could be treated in that way, but that's not typically how sizing works out. You know, you could say you want to use a smaller glass for something that's meant to be served cold because you'll drink it in a shorter amount of time. But when you look at most of the styles that are served in smaller glasses, you know, you're looking at things like imperial stout or barley wine. These are beers that are usually best served at like 50 degrees Fahrenheit or even higher. So in a lot of cases, the way that people size glassware to go with different beers is usually so that, you know, if you think in the standard terms of like a drink, like a certain amount of alcohol that like you can serve that style, like a drink's worth of that style in that glass. That's why, you know, for like an American pale ale goes well um, in like a 16-ounce pint glass. Something like a British bitter or mild that's a little bit lower in alcohol can go in like a 28-ounce imperial pint glass. Um, Something like, you know, let's take an American barley wine that's really high in alcohol. Uh, you might drop that down to an 8-ounce snifter or even like a 6-ounce serving. So uh, oftentimes people are going to pair glassware size with alcohol content. Um, Typically how it ends up working out. If you are trying to manage serving temperature, what I usually do is, at least when I'm at home, it's all about when I pull the beer out of the fridge. Like if I'm gonna have a barley wine, I'm usually going to pull it out of the fridge maybe half an hour before I plan on opening it. With something like a Kolsch, I want that to be a bit colder, so I'm going to pull that out and pour it probably straight away. Let's see. Maria Soul asks, what's the difference between lagering and cold maturation? Is it time? Don't all beers have some amount of cold maturation? Um, yeah, a lot of beers do see beyond primary fermentation are going to see a brief period of cooling, um, basically to crash the yeast out and to help clarify the beer before it's racked out of the fermenter. Um, when most people would not consider that to be in line with lagering, and it is, you know, I haven't necessarily, I don't know that there's like a definition of like when it is for this long it becomes lagering, but usually it is a time thing. You know, a lot of times when breweries are lagering a beer, it's going to be a minimum of 2 weeks stored at that colder temperature. Like traditionalists would probably argue for more, maybe 4 weeks or even 6 weeks. But with modern production schedules, people are probably going to be, people might be shortening that time a little bit, but like at least 2 weeks, I would say, stored at that near freezing temperature to allow the beer to clarify and allow the yeast to slowly work through things. Um, Someone asked if there are other beer styles similar to Kolsch. One I would point to that's the most similar is German Pils. Um, just honestly, you stack up German Pils next to Kolsch and taste them side by side. The two are very close, I would say. Kolsch, German Pils is a pretty highly attenuated style. I'd say Kolsch can be even more highly attenuated. The two are very similar. I'll just leave it at that. Let's see. Someone asked, let's see. I've heard that they use wheat malt in Kolsch. Is that just an American thing? Yeah, if you read the BJCP guidelines, they say that wheat can be used in the production of Kölsch. I would say that that is not terribly traditional. I don't know for sure, but I don't know of any German breweries that incorporate wheat into their Kölsches. So yeah, I would imagine more so than even an American thing that that would be probably a non-German thing. Had somebody ask about similarities between Kolsch and Saison, saying kind of that in tasting them, they wanted kind of some help distinguishing between the two. Um, both of them are pale styles. The malt flavor profile is pretty similar, so I can see kind of some crossover there. I'd say the really distinct area is going to be the yeast character. You might expect some light ester character in the Kolsch, but in a in a saison, you're going to see lots and lots of ester character and also typically phenolic character, those kind of like spicy, peppery notes, which you should not be seeing in something like a Kolsch. So that's probably the biggest difference that I would cite between the two. Another one, just kind of on a perception basis, another similarity between the two is that they're both highly attenuated. So you might see similarities in the mouthfeel. However, I would expect much, much higher carbonation level in the saison than in the Kolsch. Let's see. Somebody asked what the CO2 level is like in Kolsch. I would say you're probably looking at like a 2.5 to 2.7 volumes, if I had to guess. A lot of German ales, German lagers, um, are going to fall in that range, similar to what you would expect similar to what you'd expect for like an American ale or an American lager. Just a second. Question on how you would sell a Kolsch to a casual drinker. I think that's an awesome question. Um, Kolsch, I think, is like it's a easy bridge from something like an American lager. If you are working with a customer or a friend or a family member even who's just like only drinks American lager, I think Kolsch is a pretty easy bridge into sort of a I don't want to say a slightly more refined beverage, but like it has a little bit more flavor. It's a little bit more exciting than something like an American lager, at least to me, I would say. So, the selling points I would probably use is say it's familiar in that it's light, it's refreshing, it's easy drinking, but it also has kind of some light fruit character and maybe some light hop character and slightly elevated bitterness that are going to add a little bit more interest to the drinking experience. And that's probably how I would talk about it to somebody who wasn't familiar with the style. Somebody asked about Kolsch versus cream ale. The difference between Kolsch and cream ale is that you can't find cream ales. To be entirely honest, cream ales aren't like a super common style, but one of the big differences I would say is that in a lot of cases, cream ales are going to show some amount of DMS, which is kind of like a sulfury corn-like character. Low-level DMS is pretty characteristic for those beers. Other big difference, though, is that cream ale is going to be a bit lower in bitterness and probably also a little bit lower in hop flavor and aroma. So yeah, those would be probably the biggest differences I would peg between those two styles. Let's see. Oh, this is a tough question from Chris Schiffman on what are some of the key differences you have found in non-German Kolsch beers? So like a German Kolsch versus an American Kölsch. It's tough to give like a blanket statement on that. Um, but in general, if I had to peg it to something, I would say German Kolsches are probably usually a little bit more highly attenuated and a little bit better integrated, more nuanced in their presentation. Um, One of the things that sometimes happens in American interpretations of styles from other parts of the world is American brewers, and this probably reflects the American public's palate, don't always aim for subtlety. It's kind of like, well, Kolsch should have some fruity ester character to it, so they might ferment it in a way where it ends up with a pretty significant level of esters. Um, so I, like I said, I hesitate to make blanket statements, but I would say also a little bit attention to detail comes into play. Um, you look at the breweries in Germany that produce Kolsch, and like that's what they make. They just make Kolsch. So they're 100% of their focus is on brewing this style perfectly. Whereas for most brewers in the US or outside of Germany, it's going to be one of many beers in a portfolio. And so it may not receive quite the level of attention to detail that you'd see out of a German brewer. I've got somebody asking about water in Kolsch. Man, everybody always coming at me with the water questions. I don't ever like pull up too much on water just because in most cases the vast majority of people I feel like don't want to hear about it, but apparently some of you do. Um, if I don't know 100%, and I tasked somebody else with trying to pull a couple sources, and they pulled up conflicting things, which is likely to be the case in a lot of situations. Um, I would guess you have like moderate mineral content, because a lot of times I feel like in really fresh Kolsch you will get a little bit of like maybe a little bit of like a sulfitic struck match character like you'd see in water that had some level of sulfates to it. And also, if you think about like Kolsch in the same vein as German pills, those are usually brewed with water that has a little bit higher mineral content to it that helps give it kind of that like crisp bitterness. But you're not looking at anything like Burton water like people do to produce IPAs. People aren't adding like a ton of gypsum to brew these beers. Let's see. Are there any other things in there? Let's see. Not seeing a ton of other questions. I did see some questions in the chat about alt beer versus Kolsch, and so I'll touch on that really, really briefly. Alt beer and Kolsch are often talked about as sort of a style family a little bit, just because they're from similar places and they stand out uh, from other German styles in that they're both ales. Outside of that, though, they're pretty different styles. Kolsch, as you can see, is like golden. Alt beer is usually like dark amber to brown in color, so very different malt bill. Alt beers also are usually like really bitter. Like I think the BJCP specs on it are like 25 to 50 IBUs. They can be pretty strikingly bitter. One thing that I will say, alt beer more than any other style that I've ever encountered, I didn't really understand what that style was until I visited Dusseldorf. Like I mentioned earlier, like with Kolsch, like if you can get to Cologne, it's awesome. You're going to have amazing experience drinking it there. But like you can drink Kolsch in the US or in other parts of the world, and you can understand what the style is supposed to be. With alt beer, like when I went to Dusseldorf and had alt beer for the first time, I was like, oh, that's what it's supposed to taste like. Like I had never had a beer in the US, and that really replicated that. Since then, I've seen some breweries in the US that are like specifically focused on German styles that do a pretty credible job of reproducing the style. But really, the only one you can buy here in the US from Dusseldorf is Zum Odege's alt beer, and like I've never had that in the bottle where it was like even remotely fresh. And at that point, it's really not doing a good job of showing how the style is supposed to come across. So let's see. People want to know what some of my favorite Kolsches are. I'll finish out on that note. Um, I've always had a soft spot for Zuner Kölsch. I really like Zuner, and part of that is probably driven by the fact that I have a longtime friend who worked for Artisanal Imports for a very long time, and so went to a number of Zuner events with him. And then when I did finally get around to going to Cologne, I went and spent some time at the Zuner Brewery, and that was really fantastic. But also, I really like Gaffel. I've one that I had in Cologne that I've never seen anywhere else is Peter's Kolsch that I really liked there. And then I think it starts with a P. Yes, thank you, Linus. It's the Fafken Kolsch, or however it's pronounced. My German pronunciation is just terrible. Um, so yeah, I would say that's another Kolsch that I really love. So thank you guys once again for joining us. I loved talking about Kolsch. I'm really excited next week to talk about goose with all you guys. So if you haven't already, find a goose and let's get together and talk about it next week. If you want to check out a little bit more content from us, check out Neil's CBS Prep Talk tomorrow. And other than that, I'm going to sign off. I'll hopefully see you guys in a week. Thanks.